Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday. Gosh, what is it? June 18th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Okay, we've now got a video, an echo. That's fun. And it seems to be gone. No, it's not gone. So, I know. Hang on, folks. I'm going to fix this. Huh. Never had the echo before. Problem is, I'm hearing my voice in my head, everything I'm saying. So, let's go and find. All right. Bear with me. There we are. Source killed. Good. Now, where were we? You're over there. You're over there. And you are there. Okay. I was saying, Architects and Engineers is a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing a growing body of more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2 in this series of 9/11 An Architect's Guide. This is part 3, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperature incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these skyscrapers. And so Andy's not here today, so we won't be able to take your questions unless he shows up. And we'll give you instructions on how to do that. Oh, there he is. Hey, Andy, welcome aboard.
Hello, everybody. Sorry that I'm late today.
Great to have you. As always, I was just letting people know that we can take questions now that you're here. Do you want to let them know how to do that? Oh, you're on mute, Andy. Yeah, let them know how to take questions.
All right. So I just let everyone know I'm here for any technical glitches, which do occur from time to time.
Yeah, and like just happened. I was hearing myself in my head, Andy, for about 5 minutes. I couldn't even figure it out. Finally, I realized I had the YouTube monitor going on. So, yeah, they happen. Go ahead.
Well, that's going to happen when you have a group like ours fighting a system. We don't have the technical capabilities of a CNN or Fox News or NBC, but we have better information that's more truthful. So with all that said, you can submit your questions by going to our website, which is ae911truth.org. You select the live webinars under the what does the top category say here? I always say it every week, and now it eludes me. It's under Get Involved, Continuing Education. Select the live webinars. There's a box there. You can best way to submit your questions. I will see them. I'll also be looking at the YouTube broadcast of this and on our Facebook page for any comments or questions that are related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And then I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And so let's get going. Let's start off right off the bat. There's a reason we have 3,000 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation. And that's because we're a technical organization with 25,000 years of technical and professional credibility. And one of the things we do is use a scientific method, more so than NIST did, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And we have a question in the scientific method, in this case, how do the towers come down, right? We've had the scientific method in the West for 100 years or so. It's really quite honed. We use it to evaluate fantasy from reality, fact from fiction, winnow error from truth. And we do background research to come up with a hypothesis. We make observations. How have other towers come down in this case? The hypothesis is our best guess as to how the towers came down. Maybe the jet planes brought them down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires. Maybe it was explosions. And we'll see. We saw a lot of evidence for that in last week's part 2 of this series. If you missed it, be sure to go to YouTube and search 9/11 An Architect's Guide Part 2, in which we looked at the explosive demolition of these towers. Maybe it was controlled demolition. We looked at that evidence also. Today we'll be looking at more of it. We make predictions based on these hypotheses. Well, if that were true, what else would be true? We test the predictions with experiments. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we do. We don't hide the computer input data, for instance, as NIST has done, as we saw a couple of weeks ago in part 1 of this series, not releasing it to the American people. In fact, hiding it from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. Yeah, they said, well, it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this information to you, which we had requested in a Freedom of Information Act. It's just ludicrous. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll find that NIST's was not, we go back, construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is corroborated by the evidence. And then we report it again. So let's look at some of the forces that destroy buildings. This is a quick fire from last week. Fire is an organic process. It certainly destroyed buildings, but not high-rises before 9/11. But let's say a wood frame building, we have a chaotic process, obeying the laws of entropy, increasing disintegration, if you will. It burns through an area, these fires, in roughly 20 minutes or so. That's all the fires, the time that fires have. That's all the fuel they have. In a modern office building, particularly, even NIST acknowledged such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 minutes or 30 minutes, which is a direct contradiction to their whole theory of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, because they claim that those fires were burning an awfully long time. But there's been much hotter, longer lasting and larger fires in skyscrapers. but they don't fall over, not one of them. Wood frame buildings could fall over, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the way, but say the wood frame building might fall over. But what about steel frame buildings? How might they behave? Well, we have an incredible precedent in the UK. An 8-story building was built out of some fireproof and some not fireproofed steel beams and columns. As you see here, not fireproofed. And they put incredible fuel loads inside these buildings, worst case possible scenario, to try to get it to fail. And they set this fire. And let's take a look here, see what happens.
And Richard, just want to let you know I'm not hearing the audio from that.
Oh, that's not good. No audio. All right. Now, that's the first time we've ever not had audio come through, Andy. And now we've got our second glitch. Fascinating. So what I'm going to do for today is turn up the audio on the speaker and just move the microphone over here and we'll force it. That should help. I'm going to start this video over for everybody. And thanks, Andy.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. Andy, do you hear that video okay?
Yes, I heard it perfectly.
Oh, beautiful. Thanks. Sorry about the video, guys. We'll figure that one out. Anyway, so this is really important. And the results of this study, that this is an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Okay. Let's look at some other buildings that collapsed naturally. In this case, earthquakes. These are buildings that fell over, like you might expect. There's certainly damage to the building, but it's recognizable as a building. We have the concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. That's what you might expect in a real natural collapse. We looked at last week at what we found in the case of the Twin Towers. These buildings were exploded. They have thick volumes of rapidly expanding pyroclastic-like clouds, expanding due to the incredible heat from the ignition of these gases from the explosives. There's a solidly defined edge as these clouds expand in cauliflower-shaped forms. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story of what happened on 9/11, other than the airplanes that hit the towers. So let's look and see how we might use explosions to bring buildings down quite effectively in a process called controlled demolition. Here's a number of them. This is something only a handful of very crafted companies can do. This with the structural engineering. They have to locate the strongest points of the building, put thousands of shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams, removing the structure all at once, which results in what you see here. rapid disintegration of the building. Now, we've seen this in the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance. And so there's a set of features that goes along with controlled demolition. We started this process last week. In fact, we found there's a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because the columns are removed in a patterned way that allows for that, resulting in a free fall acceleration or near free fall straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance. And feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. Feature number 7, patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. Broken up concrete floors. You don't want to have to go back in and jackhammer these floors. And it's very dangerous work. And of course, visible explosives called squibs or isolated explosive ejections are quite prevalent in the videos. And then chemical evidence left behind in the debris of explosive residue. If you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of these features are caused by fire, let alone all of them. So if we have any of these features, we're pretty darn sure we have a controlled demolition. Fires can cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance, at least wood frame structures historically, not steel framed, fireproofed structures. Like these ones, where we have much hotter, longer lasting, and larger fires in these buildings. Let's look at a few of them.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
Well, fascinating. So until 9/11, we have not had these collapses. Now I've got good news for Andy, which is good news for you guys. I figured out why my screen didn't, the audio didn't come out. So I'm going to reshare my screen and do it right this time. You have to click the share audio. That's the secret. So now our videos you should be able to hear us, which means I can put my headset back on. And we'll just keep on rocking and rolling here. All right. So, like you said, Building 5, fully engulfed in fire. If any of these World Trade Center skyscrapers were to collapse due to fire, we'd expect it to be this one, right? No. Mid-rise and high-rise steel frame fire-protected buildings do not collapse due to fire. And since 9/11, we've had a whole bunch of extremely hot fires, as you can see here. Not one of them collapsed either. So real important precedents. And yet these fires brought these buildings down in 12 seconds. Cooler fires. So why haven't we lost a high skyscraper before 9/11 due to fire? Well, steel conducts the heat away from the building. The heat away from the source of the fire. The steel, before it ever gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. So even non-fireproof buildings typically do not fail. And so that's really important, as you saw in the test in the UK, in that 8-story building. But just to keep that from becoming a problem, we put cementitious fireproofing, which lasts 4 to 6 times longer than fires even have fuel to burn in any given area of the building. So that's an incredible redundancy there. Remember, NIST had acknowledged fires only burn 20 to 30 minutes in a given area. So we also keep tenants from bringing in fuel loads that would be compromising to the building, and we make sure the buildings are not built out of flammable materials. And just to keep all that from ever becoming a problem with fire, we sprinkler these buildings. In the case of the Twin Towers, the sprinklers were said to have been damaged by the impact of the airplane. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence like government documentation could be very helpful. We found that to be the case in part 1 of this series. And foreknowledge of the destruction of these buildings, because you don't just plan on bringing these down in a day, so people tend to know about it. Experts will agree that that's a controlled demolition, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building has been demolished. You know, they look at the videos and so forth. With video documentation too, all that can become proof of controlled demolition. Today we want to complete applying that proof to the Twin Towers. Last week, we looked at feature 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We found all that was proof of direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Again, I encourage you to look up 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 2. There's several versions of this webinar from that series, from that Part 2. On YouTube. And none of these are indicative of evidence that could possibly account for them, i.e. the official story can't possibly account for it. Today we're going to be moving forward now and looking at evidence of extreme heat in the form of pyroclastic-like clouds, first of all, because the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, the authority in the U.S. on this, and partially many parts around the world as well. Thermal effects. It says, look for thermal effects. Okay, this is interesting, including the large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, like you see issuing out of the sides, all sides of both towers in all the photographs and all the videos, racing down the street, increasing the volume of these clouds 10 times in just 30 seconds. Incredible amount of energy and heat producing this. And it's not the heat from those fires that we saw. It's a whole lot more heat expanding these clouds. Not the heat from these fires, but something on the order of this, which is what we're going to be looking at today. So stay tuned here. Let's start with examples of molten steel and iron. What are we talking about here? Well, let's jump to Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor and get a clue.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out? There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble. And the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later,
Come on, 6 weeks later.
as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flame.
Why does this video keep stopping?
Which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's when the fire's going to still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Okay, it took a long time. And what do some of these witnesses say? Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile several weeks after the collapse, says David Scott from Arup Associates. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the event, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down, metal dripping from a beam, molten steel beams to human remains. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. And Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition Inc., one of the cleanup companies, molten steel was encountered primarily during the excavation of debris. There are both videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. And who's this? A little river of steel flowing? Says who? Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, a witness of this molten metal. They call it molten steel. We'll find out what it is today. And his associate, Richard Garlock from Lyra, the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, like you see here in pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Yellow hot and white hot liquid molten metal. This says, oh, this must be melted airplane. Well, no, molten aluminum looks, it doesn't glow bright yellow and white hot. It's silvery in daylight conditions like this. And you can see it pouring out white hot and yellow liquid molten metal flowing out of the debris held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. In the New York Police Museum, we have an exhibit today with melted concrete that says fire temperatures were so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It melts at 3,200 degrees. So what kinds of temperatures do we have from office fires? Not even 25% of these temperatures. How about jet fuel? Even less. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says the FEMA report author. The FEMA report came out earlier. There's a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. And yet here's the evaporated steel, some of it. Documented also by Abolhassan Asani Azel, a structural engineer formerly with UC Berkeley, National Science Foundation grant to study the steel he had. He says, if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with the clocks that are kind of melted, it can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. But that doesn't happen by office fires. Take a look at this.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Okay. Well, this is also documented by FEMA in their 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report. In the appendix, which came out and which FEMA put out originally, but which was taken out by NIST. What do they find in the metallurgical examination of the steel? A 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. This doesn't happen by normal office fires. They document also rapid oxidation and sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, again, 2,800 degrees. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. Well, where did this sulfur come from? NIST says, well, this is documented, perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation by the New York Times. It's completely ignored by NIST, omitted. This entire Appendix C omitted from the NIST report. They threw it out. And regarding the presence of sulfur, which is so well documented, they say, well, gosh, it might have been sulfur from the gypsum wallboard. What? Gypsum wallboard has inert calcium sulfate, but in its 100-year history, it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. And if that is your theory, you test it with experiments, like John Cole did in his backyard, a civil engineer in Florida. He tried to get these fires up to 2,000 degrees, did his best, put gypsum wallboard in there, no sulfur attack on the steel whatsoever. The smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. It burned, that smell, says John Phil, the hero at Ground Zero, who was so badly injured trying to help folks. And yet NIST is actively denying all this evidence. Take a look.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
Down below, and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Well, here he is on the pile, finding the very piece of steel from World Trade Center 7 that was partly evaporated at the end of the steel beams. He had given it also to FEMA, who had published that and put it in their Building 7, in their same report regarding Building 7. His shadow is all over the evidence. So the source, here's Thomas Iger says, well, maybe the temperatures were 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit at the World Trade Center. But the jet fuel itself only burns about 600 degrees in open air. So jet fuel can't possibly be responsible for that. This is one of their main manufacturers of the jet fuel. So hydrocarbons, which are desks and chairs and so forth, only burn up to about 1,400 degrees in the worst situations. And yet steel and iron had definitely melted here, as we've already seen plenty of evidence for. And see here, by the color of molten metals, you can tell the temperature. That's just the physics of it. Here we're exceeding 2,500 degree temperatures. So how is that even possible? What caused all this steel and iron to melt also? Well, NIST is forced to deal with this in a very frequently asked question. They suggest that any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposures to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Oh yeah, this doesn't make any sense. It violates the law of conservation of energy, which says in a closed system, such as fires burning under a pulverized concrete and in water, under the basements of the World Trade Center, lots of water. They said they poured a lake down there. The amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. It doesn't work like that. You can only convert the energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. Feature number 10. Gosh, evidence of thermite. Let's look at the chemical evidence left behind here. Could thermite have actually produced all that molten metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here. I mean, if thermite were used, it would explain the presence of elemental iron all over the place, which we're going to see lots and lots of examples of. It would today. It would explain the incredible heat, the 4,000 degree temperatures produced by thermite. For instance, it would also explain the presence of sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So we have done some research that allows us to produce a hypothesis here of incendiaries that is so far supported by some of the evidence. Let's look at the rest. The National Fire Protection Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation says, also look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite and other pyrotechnic materials. This says, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Oh, but when pressed over a year later, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Wait a minute. You can't find what you won't look for. But others did. So, for instance, Stephen Jones is one of them, former professor at Brigham Young University, nuclear physicist. And he does some background research like we do in the scientific method, producing a characteristic burn pattern thermitic reactions would have, like a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. A whitish cloud of oxide, aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising off the top of that pouring liquid molten iron. And like we see trailing the freely flying structural steel sections ejected out of the towers, which we looked at in detail last week in this webinar series, trailing thick white smoke clouds. Did you know, I'm being facetious, that steel beams and columns are flammable? No, they're not flammable in any kind of office fire or jet fuel environment. So why are they trailing thick white smoke clouds? This looks more like the volcanic eruption from the Tongan Sea with the geometry of fireworks. Freely flying solid objects with extreme temperatures trailing these thick white smoke clouds. Identical on both of the towers. This is not unique. Steel beams on fire?
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
But they're not flammable, except under absolutely extraordinary conditions. There's a signature of thermite. It would leave behind a unique chemical evidence, Dr. Jones says. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. More unusual elements, though, such as fluorine and manganese, left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table. Well, somebody sent him a piece of this meteorite, this 40-pound chunk. They call them meteorites, this fused molten iron, as you'll see. Sent to Stephen Jones. He does some analysis on it. Electron microprobe data. He can determines that it's predominantly iron. It's not steel. And it's not aluminum from jet planes. So this is very interesting. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. Well, we haven't used iron in skyscrapers in over 100 years. Elemental iron. It has aluminum, sulfur, potassium, key ingredients of thermite. So he determines that this is the residue of thermite. But it just gets a lot deeper than that. It has manganese and fluorine in abundance. Where do they come from? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges. So these are often present in the residue, and so they're part of this thermite fingerprint. This still gets more interesting, though, because sol-gels would leave a super thermite binder, would leave yet another residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Okay, do we have any of that? Well, the EPA analysis of the dust finds one molecule that present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. This is unique. Okay, what about structure, the sculpture in Manitoba Peace Park, which is, again, a small piece of the slag, was sent to Stephen Jones for sampling. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis, finding iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, carbon. These elements typical of the signature of ignited thermite. Also, well, you can make your own shaped cutter charges out of thermite in your own backyard, as again John Cole, civil engineer, did. And he applies it and sets it off.
The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait a minute. Where did we see this before? Thinned to razor sharpness? Oh, in the FEMA metallurgical examination in Appendix C of their Building Performance Assessment Report on the steel from World Trade Center Twin Towers. Well, there are much more sophisticated devices than the one John Cole made. They're patented. They use thermite to issue streams of molten iron on the order of hundreds of milliseconds. These were invented before 9/11. It's much more expensive than typical RDX or C4 shaped cutter charges with high energy explosives. Why would they not have used more common controlled demolition charges? Well, those provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes. So maybe they wouldn't want those audio and visual signatures that would give away what is otherwise, hopefully, a deceptive controlled demolition, a series of 3 of them now. There are devices whose casings themselves are made of consolidated consumable thermite. Nothing left except pools of molten iron, which were seen as we already saw throughout the World Trade Center. But what else was found in this powder that we talked about last week? 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized to a fine powder, and it drifted from river to river over Manhattan. The U.S. Geological Survey, in their particle atlas completed in 2005 of the World Trade Center dust, finds billions of these previously molten iron microspheres. The largest are about a 16th of an inch in diameter. Smallest of them are almost naked to the human eye. They don't know where they came from. But up to 30%, up to 6% of some of these samples are molten iron microspheres. It amounts to about 4 tons of previously molten iron microspheres in all the World Trade Center dust samples. It's about 150 times more common, more prevalent in dust than iron particles are in common office building dust, as you see here. They're not spherical either. It's clearly not from that. In fact, R.J. Lee Group, who's also doing studies on the dust, finds that they're formed during the event, not before and during construction. The welders, not after, by the iron workers tearing the steel apart with their oxyacetylene torches and thermal lances, but during the event. But they don't know how that happened. They don't speculate. They're so prevalent, these spheres, that they're used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these spheres, which we don't know where they came from. Well, where could they have come from? Let's look at a thermite experiment here by physicist Stephen Jones. In a controlled fashion, we see hundreds of sparks upon letting it off, but they're really not sparks. They cool as molten iron droplets in all the World Trade Center dust. You see, aerosolized liquids produce droplets. In the case of molten iron, they cool and they form and they fall. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars all around the World Trade Center? What other rational explanation is there from the official narrative that could possibly explain the toasting of the tops of these cars in this very high heat event? Okay, we're not done yet. What else was found in the World Trade Center dust? A team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collected 7 samples independently, like the one from Jeanette McKinley's apartment here. Her windows were blown in. She lived right across the street on Liberty Street from the South Tower. Her apartment filled with dust. All these tenants were absolutely terrorized. And she used as an artist, she used the dust in her artwork, and she paid for that decision with her life. Unfortunately, she died of brain cancer a few years later. But one of those samples is here. They all contain these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They thought they were paint, but they're attracted by a magnet. And this is how they pull these out of the dust. They get real curious and zoom into the, do analysis, X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis on the red layer, finding what? Iron oxide and aluminum, sulfur, carbon, and oxygen too. Silica, carbon, and oxygen in this case. The ingredients of thermite, unignited thermite. Okay, this is fascinating. They zoom into the red layer 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and find nanoparticles of iron oxide powder and aluminum powder in the crystal formations, rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Okay, this is not normal thermite, right? This is some other special kind of thermite. And it's set in a bed of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. This is the material, organic material used in the expansion of the concussive force that TNT uses to knock things over. It gets very interesting because in the peer-reviewed literature out there on super thermite, they actually take this nanothermite and they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, and at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit, it ignites, producing incredible energy. And that's exactly what these chips did in the DSC by this team of scientists. And what happens when that energy is released? A lot of heat and molten iron droplets with the same chemical signature as the molten iron droplets that are produced from the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those molten iron droplets, we'll call them molten iron microspheres, came from in the World Trade Center dust. They came from these chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see we have a set of internally consistent, repeatable, corroborative, experimentally repeatable evidence that can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. See, because this stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only by the most advanced, sophisticated Defense Department, arms industry laboratories. The peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal finds that the red layer is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology with a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive, is what it is. So that's an extraordinary paper that remains unchallenged to this day. Nobody's put forth a peer-reviewed paper citing a challenge to this. That's how you challenge somebody's theory if you don't like it. And there's a lot of people who don't like this peer-reviewed paper because it challenges the official narrative. It pulls the rug out from under it as to how these towers came down. So what we've shown today is direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries. Very unusual for controlled demolitions, but as we've seen, entirely probable. In fact, factual. This is not evidence from fire doesn't create any of these features, obviously, let alone all of them. Fires can cause less robust structures to collapse again. They do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Especially these fires are not going to be causing the catastrophe that we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks. And these fires are relatively cool, less than 200 degrees Fahrenheit, if you believe the thermal imaging infrared camera that was trained upon it and released through a Freedom of Information Act request. What do the experts say? At least those experts who don't have financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether this was a controlled demolition or not. Like Ron Brookman, it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as NIST claims? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in under 12 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Let's not sweep it under the rug. Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer. The fires were very weak. NIST reports confirm that steel temperatures were low. Hold on one second. I'm going to make a note there. The World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire collapse because there hasn't been any. Just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything, says Mike Bloomberg, comparing engineers to engineers. He has an engineering degree. So, I mean, the forensic analysis of the steel is actually extremely important. But there's a problem. They didn't really have the opportunity to do a detailed forensic analysis because it was destroyed. Let's look at Abu Hassan Hassani Azal again.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
The evidence that the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling? Well, this prompted Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. Easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. 400 truckloads a day were removed from the World Trade Center site starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. More evidence that prompts so many through the scientific method to cite that today we looked at features 8, 9, and 10. Last week we looked at features 1 through 7. Altogether, direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony that we've looked at over the last 2 weeks, we find this to be proof of controlled demolition using the scientific method. And that's why we now have more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. So I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. Andy, how do we do that today?
All right. Can everybody hear me just fine?
I hear you.
All right. Very good. So please submit any questions that you might have in the same input form, and we'll do our best to answer them. Again, that is at ae911truth.org. You can go under continuing education, select the live webinars. There's a box right there. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you are informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, cool. You heard the man, and you can, while you're there, subscribe to our newsletter. It comes out once every couple of weeks. The latest evidence that we have, the latest efforts we're getting toward real investigation, which I'll give you some updates on today too. Very exciting news. And we want you to get informed. At a minimum, go onto the website and look at the additional videos and evidence that we have. It's extraordinary what we've put together here. And while you're there, sign the petition. You don't have to be an architect or engineer. You can be one of 20,000 others supporting the 3,000 architects and engineers who have signed the petition. And while you're there, please support us. 8E911 Truth is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We're all over the place, giving conferences to engineers, architects, talking to elected representatives, doing radio interviews. There's a half a dozen of us on the staff, and we have a lot of work to do, and we can't do all of it without your support. So please join the family of sustaining supporters while you're there, and give monthly. A cup of coffee a month with 2,000 people is the only reason we're barely able to keep our doors open. So please step up and do your part too. If you can't donate, please volunteer. There's so many things you can do. Isn't that right, Andy?
Absolutely. It's one of the most satisfying things in the world that you can do. I know lots going on in the world right now. It's easy to feel powerless, but you don't have to be powerless. You can participate, and you don't have to shoulder it all alone. There's a lot of little jobs out there, little and big, but it's small things done well every single day that are going to win this battle for us. Even my dog agrees. You can hear him in the background. So how do you get involved? The simplest way is to go to ae911truth.org. That's where all the action happens. There's a volunteer form right on that site. You fill it out. Very short. We don't ask too many questions. I just need your phone number and your email, basically. And I'll get in touch with you. We'll find out where you will best fit on one of our many task-oriented teams, and we'll put you there. And believe me, that little bit goes a long way. So please consider doing that.
Hey, maybe you like to work alone. Here's some things you can do. Just reach out to your elected representatives in television, radio, newspaper. Tell them we will come and talk to them with you. Make an appointment with your congressperson, and we will do the talking. Andy will tell you more about how that works. But tell everyone you know, every architect and engineer you can find. Screen the DVDs that we have available on YouTube and on our store. Share the brochures one-on-one. We have some really good brochures. For $10 you can get 100 of them. It'll help you let us help you do the work for you. Handing them a brochure from 8E911 Truth is just a whole lot better than citing what you might remember or not remember from seeing one of these webinars, for instance. And let me tell you also about the evaluation, which thousands of our supporters have collectively donated for a $300,000 finite element analysis modeling. A major university study has just come out, 4 years in the making, with lots of work on World Trade Center Building 7. And guess what they found? They found that fire didn't cause the collapse of World Trade Center 7 as NIST did. They found that it didn't collapse due to progressive collapse, but it was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all its columns. Well, what can do that? Well, that in part is what prompted 5 New York area fire commissioners from this town to declare that they are making a resolution calling for a new investigation. And that new investigation is coming to Washington, D.C. too. How's that going to happen, Andy?
So, right, we are in a period of a lot of outreach to Washington, D.C., and it's on a couple of fronts. Right now, we're conducting phone meetings with members of Congress or their staffers. You can be a part of that, and it's surrounding our request for correction that's been submitted to NIST. Getting Congress involved, letting them know they're watching. So if you want to be a part of that, you can first reach out to your congressman, try to request the meeting. There's advice right on our site that tells you how to do that. If you need more direct advice, write to us at congress@ae911truth.org, or submit the request first and then tell us you did it at that same email address, and we'll help you along the way to get that meeting. So please be part of that. And then what that leads into is what you're seeing here is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. As you can see, it says the path to justice for the nearly 3,000 victims who died that day, one of which was Bobby McIlvaine. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower lobby that morning. And since that doesn't jive with the official explanation we've been given, we named the bill after him. And this is something that would set up a select committee passed in either house of Congress to investigate exactly what Richard has been laying out in these 3 webinars this month, to actually look into the evidence of controlled demolition at the World Trade Center, not just to regurgitate talking points. It's written in such a way so you get what we're looking for. But Congress doesn't do anything unless people, their constituents, participate. So the way to participate is get involved in our congressional actions, like I was laying out before, and know about this bill. You can learn more about it by going to ae911truth.org/justice. You can print out a copy of the bill along with a letter from Richard and Bob. And if you've only got a few minutes, you can even just put in your address and it'll generate a letter that's already been written for you if you want to go that route. Take the time while you're quarantined and call your congressman's office. Let them know that you support the Bobby McIlvaine Act and you want them to do so as well. But if everybody get involved, then we'll be a step closer to justice and having that final acknowledgement in the end. So please get involved and do this.
Yeah, join us, because there's all kinds of exciting things that are going on here. We've got the U.S. attorney in Manhattan to agree in writing to comply with the law requiring him to give our petition with 60 exhibits of this evidence that you've been looking at during this webinar series to a special grand jury. Now, we've already filed a mandamus lawsuit to force him to show that that's been done. So stand by for results from that, as well as the appeal that we have now filed in the lawsuit against the FBI, which requires them to give the evidence that they have of ours to Congress. They have proven that they have the evidence. They even remarked quite nicely about it, citing that it appears backed by thorough research and analysis, and yet they did not comply with congressional mandate to give them the evidence they gathered since the 9/11 Commission report in the 2015 Congressional Review. 9/11 Congressional Review. 9/11 Review Commission, it's actually called. So, and finally, I want to show you that we have an excellent tool that you can use to win over even the most skeptical of people if they're willing to watch a video. Here's 4 minutes of it. It's called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. We've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. Here's just a taste.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yep, it's all there. And you can get it in our store, the 90-minute version, along with additional Meet the Experts DVD with extended interviews from all of them. Extraordinary collection there. But you can watch it free on YouTube, the 1-hour version also. So I encourage you to pass that around. And the 50-page booklet can be downloaded for free from beyondmisinformation.org. So take advantage of that, or get the actual desktop version, coffee table version, real quality printing for, I think it's like $10 in our store at ae911truth.org. Our original video on this subject, documentary, is a presentation similar to these documentaries of all 3 towers, and it is available free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary narrated by actor Ed Asner on Building 7. So if you have people that are really important, they only have 15 minutes, ask them, hey, you have 15 minutes? I got to show you this. Building 7 is your gateway into the discussion about 9/11. And this was very high quality, produced for PBS, and it aired on PBS. Just like, by the way, our current short film on Building 7 made by Dylan Avery called 7, story about Leroy Halsey and the finite element modeling of Building 7. That film is the 5-minute version of it's playing all around the country now, thanks to you who donated, hundreds and hundreds of you, $9,000 to get that film shown on PBS around the country. Very, very exciting. 9 million people are guaranteed to have seen it over the next 3 months. Hey, let's get to the questions. What do you think, Andy?
There we go. Yes, we have 2 questions today. The first one asks, I know part 3 is to do with heat, but I couldn't help notice that when you showed the videos of various demolitions, I didn't see any squibs that resulted from air pressure during the descents of those structures. Any comments?
Yeah, this is actually kind of complicated. There are a number of controlled demolitions, and they show squibs, isolated explosive ejections, many of them, not all of them. It's one of the key characteristic features that we looked at last week coming out of the Twin Towers, because there's all of these isolated explosive ejections coming out of the Twin Towers. And they've been clocked by physicists, David Chandler in particular, 80 miles an hour. Is that right? I think it's just about that. 150 to 200 feet per second. Anyway, and NIST was asked very frequently about this, which is why it appears in their very frequently asked questions. And they write back and suggest that, well, this is air pressure emitting from the towers because the top portion, they tell us, pushed the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. That's their theory that we decimated in last week's webinar. But they say that's air pressure pushing those out. Well, if that were true, we might expect some air pressure, I think is the essence of this question, pushing out squibs in normal controlled demolitions. I don't know if that's true because there aren't that many top-down controlled demolitions. NIST is taking advantage of the top-down collapse, which they call it, the top-down destruction of the Twin Towers, to tell us that this pile driver's pushing that air down and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, first of all, we showed that top portion destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds. So there's no piston or pile driver pushing it down. We also showed that the open office area in the Twin Towers is such that if that air pressure was being pushed down the hoistway and it came out into this open office area, well, it might blow out all the windows or none of them, but not these geometrically precise, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that we see coming out of the Twin Towers, 20, 40, even 60 stories below. So, yeah, I don't think NIST has a leg to stand on here. Andy, you might have something else to add to that.
I think you pretty much covered it there. I mean, the whole squibs air pressure thing has been debunked for a number of years, and you can see that very clearly. These are mistimed explosions going off far below the collapse line. And I don't think there's anything else to say. The last question says, is it possible to find out where the 2 layered chips came from, similar to how they found out where the anthrax came from?
I'll bet it is. There's some peer-reviewed literature on super thermite, and Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab is like kind of at the forefront of putting it out. And they haven't written us and said, oh, you found our thermate. And we're not, I guess, official enough to warrant getting attention from them were we to write them and say, is this your thermite? Or do you know whose thermite this is? I guess I'm just not naive enough. I don't know. Maybe it's worthwhile. We should just send them some of this thermite or the thermite paper, Andy, and say, do you know where this might have come from? I guess it's also could be kind of dangerous. I don't know. As if what we're doing isn't already dangerous enough. What do you think, Andy?
Maybe they'll say, oh, yeah, we were looking for that. No, I think the problem is that if you had anthrax spreading around a certain area, they would acknowledge that it was that and look for the specific strain to see where it came from. But in this case, we're dealing with trying to get them to acknowledge that there was thermite to begin with. So that then you go to the next step. Once you get that acknowledgement and say, whose thermite was this? But of course, we don't have the kind of legal power that a U.S. government agency does. So it would be nice to get a legal agency on our side to issue those kinds of orders and do everything that they need to do. But it is a great idea. And if there is a way to trace it, maybe that's something we should look at.
Absolutely. And keep those great questions coming. In fact, somebody is coming up with the best questions. We want to have you put those together and put your name on it and publish it and send a copy to NIST. So let's find out how we can get that done. And I just love the questions we get here on this webinar series. Today was part 3 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat. We looked at high-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron, which has no possible way of forming itself in official narrative. Iron microspheres, which is direct evidence of ignited thermite. Thermite and nanothermite, which is evidence of unignited thermite. Yeah, it's all here. We looked at it. Last week, we looked at the explosive destruction of the Twin Towers. Guess what? We come back in July. Actually, Thursday. Let's clarify this, Andy. We got July 4th coming up. And might as well set our schedules, you guys, because you're not going to want to miss part 1, World Trade Center 7, are you? Thursday is, where'd Thursday go? There it is. July 2nd. So we'll go ahead and do, for sure, the first webinar in July will be on Thursday, July 2nd. And yeah, 47-story skyscraper that collapses into its own footprint in under 7 seconds on the afternoon of 9/11, straight down, uniformly, symmetrically. After witnesses hear explosions, and it all happens in the exact manner of a classic controlled demolition like the old hotels in Las Vegas, and yet we're told by NIST that this thing came down by normal office fires. Get that. Get the information. This is the smoking gun of 9/11. It's so obvious to even a third grader that this is controlled demolition. That's why we keep it up. We've got the evidence. We just have to keep you guys talking about it out there. So I want to thank Andy and thank everybody else who joined us. Share and spread and like the video on Facebook and YouTube, all that stuff. Subscribe to our channel and keep informed. We'll catch up with you July 2nd. Thanks. Bye for now.